Okay, welcome to the fourth in our webinar series. This is co-sponsored by the World Resources Institute, the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, and the New America Foundation. I'm Judy Greenwald. I'm Director of Innovative Solutions with the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. This is the fourth in our Cap and Trade webinar series. We've already heard a webinar on Introduction to Cap and Trade, Program Scope and Point of Regulation, and Electricity Sector Options. This one is our first in-depth Cap and Trade design issues. It's Cap and Trade design issues in depth, part one. And we have three really great speakers with us today. We have Brian McLean, who's the director of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Atmospheric Programs. And I would give you a long introduction of him, except that we're getting started late. So I'll just tell you that he has a lot of experience in this and running the EPA's acid rain program and NOx trading programs, and will have a lot to tell us. Then we have Denny Ellerman, who's a senior lecturer with the Sloan School of Management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he has a wealth of experience in analyzing cap and trade design questions, both here and abroad. He's done a lot of work recently on the EU ETS and did quite a bit of work analyzing the U.S. SO2 and NOx trading programs and others as well. And we also have John Hutchinson. He's a senior policy advisor in the Air Policy and Climate Change branch at the Ministry of the Environment. And the way that we're going to run this is that we're going to start with Brian and just take one or two clarifying questions, leave most of the questions till the end, and then we'll go to John Hutchinson, and then Denny Ellerman will bat cleanup. And the way this works is the way that you ask questions, and I think some of you picked this up already when you were trying to tell us you could hear us, is that you can type in questions to the chat box on the upper left-hand corner, and we'll see those questions and either call on you in the middle or mostly at the end we'll be taking the questions. The other way that you can ask questions is you can basically raise your hand for an audio question. And what you do is you actually press *1 on your phone keypad, and that puts you in a queue, and then we'll be told that you're in a queue for asking a question. And somebody already has asked a question about when the other webinar presentations are going to be posted on our website, and I believe that soon. Also, we are circulating by email to everybody registered for this webinar, this set of slides. So you'll have the slides in your inbox shortly. And I guess, Laura, do you know when we'll have them posted, the other ones?
We're still working out the details of, but we will be having the ones that we've done so far. They'll be posted fairly soon, I would say.
Okay. So, without
notify everyone.
Okay, that would be great. Okay, so without further ado, let's get going with Brian McLean, and you should be following along on your web, and you will. Brian will be actually moving the slides, and you'll be able to move along with him. Thank you, and go ahead, Brian.
Oh, thank you, Judy. This is not my normal voice. I have a cold, so don't. If you hear from me another time, hopefully I'll sound better. But as you can tell, we're not experts in webinar technology, but we are, I think, fairly experienced in a lot of the issues related to cap and trade programs, and also are aware of things that we're not aware of with regard to cap and trade. In other words, we don't think they're the solution to everything. So I want to give you a quick overview of the experience we've had with cap and trade, which started with acid rain as the first program in the 1990 Clean Air Act, and then we applied it to NOx and wanted to talk about that. What I wanted to say is that we're quite aware, in this second slide here, there are many regulatory approaches. I have worked in other regulatory areas, and I also have voluntary programs in my office, so I'm familiar with many ways of attacking problems, and we try to apply the best tool to the problem at hand. If they're properly designed, they can work very well. Maybe it goes without saying. They can also be poorly designed and poorly applied, and they do not work very well. So cap and trade is not a panacea. It's a tool, and we have to be thoughtful about how we apply it. It works best in situations where you're concerned with aggregate impact of pollutants. If you're really dealing with one source causing an impact, cap and trade is not the way to go. So it's often thought of as ideal for greenhouse gases, which are well-mixed global pollutants, and it doesn't really matter where the emissions come from. That also works best in situations where there's a range of costs. If everything costs the same, then there's not going to be any trading or economic advantage. And it works well where there are strong regulatory institutions and financial markets. We learned this as we moved outside the U.S. to particularly developing countries, but a lot of other countries that do not have as well-developed institutions as we do in the U.S. So that's also an important prerequisite. And it can work with existing regulatory approaches, again, if it's properly designed. What I want to show you in the next couple slides is just sort of the situation that we faced in the early 90s when we were dealing with acid rain. The predominant problem, fortunately for you all, was not in the West, it was in the East, and the levels were pretty significant, and they went on up into the southeastern Canada. The sources of this, the predominant source was power plants. 70% of the emissions of SO2 came from utilities. 95% of those emissions came from coal-fired power plants. So it was natural that that became the prime focus of this particular program. In establishing the program, the legislation that we built the program from established the cap level, it established the timing of the reductions over several decades, it established the allocations, that is how we were to give the allowances to sources for their, essentially their tradable permits, as they're often called. It's important that the level of control, the cap level, was decided early in the legislative process, and the allocation process became a lot of what the legislative activity was about, but we did not go back and significantly make changes to the cap. That meant that when you did the allocations, it was basically anyone who got something meant someone else lost something, and so it was a zero-sum game. And it was important that it be done that way. I think if you do allocations first, you may not end up with the cap level that you need for environmental reasons. Distributing allowances, and Denny can talk at this much more than I can, is really an issue of equity, economic equity. The environmental aspects of distributing allowances are relatively small. The big environmental issue is the size of the cap and the timing of the reductions. We have done allocations in different ways under acid rain, under NOx, mercury, other programs where we've looked at allocations, and so the system has varied depending on the nature of the problem and what we've learned along the way in terms of implementing allocation systems. We have done direct distribution of allowances. We have a small auction in the acid rain program, and we have recently automated that. So we essentially have a hybrid, and for future systems, there are various combinations of these, and there are arguments about what's better under what circumstances to use. You need to look at allocations, we feel, at sort of balancing certainty and recognizing that over time things may change, but you don't want to have such a fluid system that the industry, which has to make investments, has no idea what their allocation is going to be next year or the year after. It's very helpful to have some kind of certainty as to what the permitted level is going to be that they're shooting for. The progress of the program and the two reasons that it's been regarded as successful. First is from an environmental perspective, there have been substantial reductions in sulfate deposition in the eastern U.S. where the problem was. This is monitored on-the-ground data, not modeling projections. And so that has gotten the program a lot of positive response. Secondly is the cost of the program. When we began in 90, the estimated cost in today's dollars was between $7 and $8 billion per year annual cost, and it has turned out to be a lot less than that, closer to $2 billion a year, and and that's why it gets a lot of attention because the cost dropped. Cost dropped for a variety of reasons. The simple trading itself is not responsible for all the cost reductions, but the flexibility allowed took advantage of improvements in economics nationally, in rail rates and coal production and various other issues. But the system generally drives people toward the lower costs and takes advantage of efficiencies. One of the issues that does not apply to greenhouse gases but does apply to a lot of other air pollutants is spatial issues related to trading. It has been a constant concern. In this particular program, we were very concerned about it, and independent analyses by the Environmental Law Institute, Resources for the Future, and Environmental Defense over the years have found that the trading under this program was not creating hotspots of concentrations. One of the reasons for that, there are two reasons for that. One is that we reduced emissions overall by 50%, and therefore there was not a tendency for emissions to rise anywhere. But secondly, we left in place the ability of states and localities to control emissions of local sources causing local problems. We didn't override that, and that means that if you've got a local problem, you can limit emissions to solve that problem. Many people think of, the way to control emissions from trading is to constrain the trading. That actually has little effect. The cap has a big effect. And if you've got a local problem, it's just better to go ahead and directly regulate the source that's creating that problem. Shifting to the NOx program, there are a couple differences with NOx, and actually it was a riskier experiment than SO2. There are both local and transported elements to NOx. There are two pollutants, NOx and VOC, that create ozone. Power generation, which had been 70% of the problem for SO2, was now only about a quarter of the problem for ozone, the dominant concern being mobile sources. So there was and lastly, it was a seasonal problem, not an annual problem, or even a longer than annual problem with acid rain in many ways. So the question was, could we apply this tool under these constrained circumstances? And we started in the upper Northeast, the Ozone Transport Commission in the green states, and then expanded that. Those states agreed together to embark on a cap-and-trade program. We worked with them, and then EPA expanded this to much of the eastern United States into what was called the NOx SIP call. And we applied it not only to utilities, but we also picked up industrial boilers, which had a lot of similarities. And so we had experience monitoring and trading with industrial facilities in that program. The NOx budget design elements I won't go into in great detail. It was obviously a 5-month program instead of an annual program. It applied to industrial boilers as well as utilities. We distributed the allowances sort of in 2 steps. First, we set budgets for states, but then each state could rearrange the allocation amongst the sources within its state as they saw fit, and to deal with a lot of the economic and political equity issues. And the last thing, under allowance use, there was this progressive flow control. There was a concern that people would raise emissions on the hottest days in the summer, and so there was a constraint put on the use of banked allowances to try to prevent that from happening. This was an anticipated problem, and in reality, we didn't find that to be a problem. And so in the later program that we are implementing now, the Clean Air Interstate Rule, with additional reductions, we dropped the progressive flow control. The NOx budget program, it's based on the monitoring requirements that we used for SO2 and the acid rain program. And by the way, those monitoring requirements under Part 75 collect CO2 data from all these sources. That was required by the Clean Air Act. So we've had hourly CO2 data from power plants since 1995. We updated those regs, and we made improvements based on what we learned in the mid-90s, and the compliance and enforcement actions are very similar. The penalties are rather automatic, and we've had over 99% compliance in both those programs. The results of the NOx program as emissions came down quite dramatically. We're very pleased. The goal was 70%. We're getting over 70% from 1990 levels from all the sources involved. On the right-hand side is the temporal daily issue that people were quite concerned about with ozone and with NOx. The question was, would sources continue to emit at the highest levels on the hottest days and only reduce on the cool days, and therefore make sort of temporal trades which wouldn't buy us the benefits we wanted out of reducing NOx from these large industrial sources. What we found from this, the red line is 2003 and the other lines are 2004, 5, and 6. And you can see we still get the fluctuations weekly and daily, but the whole line has moved down so that the peaks are also much lower than the peaks were before. So we accomplished what we wanted, and it's largely because most of the controls are not turned on and off, or it's just not worth it to turn them on and off. And so you tend to get controls over many days. The other way to look at benefits is we were trying to address ozone, and this program, since it's gone into place over the last several years, it has led to 80% of the areas in the eastern U.S. that were not meeting the ozone standard a few years ago are now better than the standard. There's a lot of credit goes to mobile source reductions, but they take a while to come into place because of the turnover of the fleet. So we're getting mobile source reductions, and we're getting 1 million tons of reduction from this program. We've gone on to the Clean Air Interstate Rule, which is an attempt to reduce SO2 and NOx further. And you can see the dotted lines show you where we expect to be over the next 10 to 15 years, putting those programs in place. Just to comment on the benefits, these programs have the largest health benefits, environmental benefits of any program we have in the air program at EPA. On the left, that $350 billion for the combination of acid rain and the NOx programs is an annual benefit. That's compared to an annual cost of around $8 billion. So it's a very substantially cost-beneficial approach, and that's the reason people have been pretty excited about it. The basic elements of these programs, you can talk about them in many different ways, and we've sort of come down to maybe these 4 as being the most important. One is covering the whole sector. So if we're doing a utility sector, it is far easier and more efficient and effective to cover the entire utility sector, not just the large sources or just the sources in a certain state, but all sources that are connected for electricity to the electricity grid. Because when we don't do that, it's easier for sources to shift production and emissions to sources not covered by the cap, in which case we have the leakage issue, which the Northeast has been concerned about in the design of their programs. It's not necessarily a reason not to do it, it's just a factor in the design of the program, and it does work a lot better if you can include all the sources that are connected in a particular sector. The second thing is the cap, of course, and the cap is not just there for environmental reasons, but it's very important for environmental reasons, but it's also a way of providing certainty in the whole allowance market, because you don't have to wonder what credits might get created and how that might dilute the market and change the prices. You know exactly how many allowances are at play, and when they move around, everyone has a much better piece of information in which to deal with costs. The third thing is monitoring, which I was involved in advocating very strongly in 1990, and I feel more strongly about it today, that accurate measurement and reporting of all emissions is absolutely essential to an effective program, that any inaccuracies or missed reporting, the whole program becomes much, much harder to deal with and much less credible. And the third thing is trading. if we feel that if we cover the whole sector, if we cap emissions, and we monitor all emissions, then we can be very flexible in the trading and banking of allowances, because nothing is being created, everything is covered, and it allows us not to be involved in individual company decisions about which technology they use or whether they change the technology. As long as we know what's coming out of the stack and as long as they're covering those emissions, it's really not important to the success of the program which technology they use. And that greatly, for those of you involved in air programs know, is a great reduction in the effort of both the federal government and the governments in the industry. There are a couple of things I just wanted to mention here. One is
Brian, can you finish up in about 2 minutes?
Yes. Emission measurement is very important. We do allow a lot of flexibility, even though we require CEMs with flow monitors, mass emissions for all large sources. Public access to data is also very important. On our web, you can get hourly data of every source in the United States. Secondly, on trading, which didn't come through here, we track that, but in the last few years we have gone to online trading so that 98% or more of the transfers are done online, which means we're not even involved. They're done instantly, and so that reduces costs tremendously. And we provide access to trading information so that people, the public, can understand who holds these allowances and where they reside. The main lesson I would say that we learned is to stay focused on the environmental goal and not get distracted by all the other factors that are involved in setting up these programs, and make sure that in the end we actually reduce emissions with high compliance. And that with regard to markets, essentially is stay out of the markets, provide the certainty in the allocations and the consequences for noncompliance, the integrity of the allowances, transparency of the data, and minimize the costs involved for everybody participating. And that's the way that we can keep the cost down so that we can, in the end, achieve the goals. Thank you. That's the end.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. I think we'll take one question just to break this up a little, but we're going to hold most of the questions to the end. I see one question, which is how do you audit and verify compliance?
We do several things. First, we collect a lot of data electronically, not just the emission data. We collect a lot of operating parameters from a source, several dozen, so that we can do an electronic audit of data. We can look for patterns and errors and cheating, let's say. The second thing we do is if we start to see patterns of problems, we do field audits. And we do that in conjunction with our regional offices in states who are physically in the vicinity, and try to couple that with other enforcement activities so that someone visiting a plant can also check to make sure that the monitoring is being operated correctly. So we do we're up to 100% electronic audits, and then we do a subset of that in field audits. Okay. Was that okay?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Brian. We're going to now move to John. There will be an opportunity to ask Brian and John and any questions at the end, but let's make sure we get everybody's presentation since we start a little bit late. So go ahead, John. Can you move to the next slide? John, do you have that capability? You need me to do it?
Yes, I do. Thanks for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure to be here. You're going to notice that the Ontario program is quite a bit smaller than the U.S. EPA program, understandably much smaller economy. So getting right on with the outline of my presentation, a lot of these categories I will skip over to a degree and perhaps focus on key elements and the discussion of credits later on. Brian has already touched on some of these concepts. The system works by placing limits on specified emitters and issuing allowances in tons equal to the limits in tons that are placed on them. They may trade the permits among each other or with anyone for that matter. There's no restriction on who can own these things. And it depends on abatement costs varying among emitters, creating the opportunity for trading to occur. The advantages: flexibility. Capped emitters are able to tailor their emissions strategies to complement rather than conflict with their business planning processes, and it enables them to eliminate suboptimal or premature investments. The overriding concern, of course, is air quality improvement, and it doesn't matter who makes the improvement as long as the air quality objective is achieved. And this is particularly true in greenhouse gas trading. It really doesn't matter where the reduction is made, whereas with things like acid deposition and to a lesser degree NOx, these things can matter. And the objective, of course, is to end up with the lowest cost solution. Emission trading is a key component of Ontario's plan to reduce NOx and SO2, and it's part of our program to reduce NOx emissions by 45% from 1990 levels and SO2 by 50%. Our experience with trading started with Regulation 397, which came into effect at the end of 2001, so that the program actually began and trading theoretically began in January of 2002. Initially, only 5 facilities were covered. Those were Ontario Power Generation facilities, and the rest of the electricity market came under the regulation in 2004. And it covers facilities having a maximum capacity of 25 megawatts. We also have Regulation 194, which came into force in 2005. This covers an additional 7 industrial sectors, and there is trading permitted between the electricity sector and these other industrial sectors. The intent is to reduce these pollutants, of course, and as Brian pointed out, if it's managed well, the allowance and the credit trading program should achieve the same air quality improvements as command and control, but at a substantially lower cost. The key elements of our system: we set sector caps for both NOx and SO2. The cap equaling the number of allowances issued each year, and ideally this diminishes over time. Variable mitigation costs, issuance of allowances or permits, permits to emit. In the case of electricity, it's based on anticipated electricity production, and the allocation in the industry sectors is based on past production and the use of intensity factors that are determined for each facility. We also have a credit creation component that I'll talk about a little bit more later on, in which uncapped emitters can earn emission reduction credits for having made real voluntary reductions. And banking is an important component of our system. Facilities can trade and use emissions to meet their compliance obligations. They're transferable among sectors, as I mentioned, and they can be used to meet obligations by balancing emissions with by surrendering an equal tonnage of allowances and credits. We have an annual set-aside, which is in the electricity sector, which is reserved for renewable and energy conservation projects. There's also a set-aside in the other 7 industrial sectors for expanded sources and new sources. In the electricity sector, continuous emission monitoring systems are required, or an estimation method that is at least as accurate. So far, we have not had anyone bring to us a method that is at least as accurate. And of course, we do have a registry, not nearly as comprehensive as the EPA registry, and we are making efforts to improve the transparency of our system through the registry. The next slide indicates the stepping down, the annual stepping down of the allowance allocation. In our case, we increased the allocation to the independent power producers in anticipation of a significant expansion in capacity in this sector associated with electricity deregulation. Deregulation did not occur, and so that we are having to deal with adjusting the allowance allocation to these emitters. And similarly with SO2, there is a step-down function in 2007, and this will be reviewed also in the near future for proposed revisions to the regulation. The next couple of slides, I won't go into detail, but they are illustrative of the gradually reducing allocation of allowances to the 7 industrial sectors for both NOx and SO2. And this brings us to the section on credits. Now, in the EPA trading system, it is strictly allowance-based, whereas in our system, we have a cap, credit, and trade system in which we have the allowances, which are permits, but also credits, which represent reductions that have been achieved in the airshed voluntarily by uncapped emitters. The advantage of having credits, incidentally, the use of credits as well as allowances is a feature of the European greenhouse gas trading program. Credits provide flexibility and liquidity for the small Ontario emissions trading market. We only have about 70 capped facilities here. It's an incentive to be clean, whether you're a capped emitter or not. It enables us to apply this incentive to mobile sources, for example, and we also require that any credit used for compliance purposes be discounted 10% as a gift to the environment. So, for example, if a facility retires 11 credits as part of its compliance obligation, only 10 of those will count towards the obligation. The 11th one is a freebie for the environment. The creation and use of credits, however, does require a high degree of rigor, and we demand that emission reductions upon which credits are based must be real, unique, surplus, quantifiable, and verifiable. Credits can be harvested from a project, an emission reduction project, for up to 7 years from the completion date of the project. They can be banked indefinitely, as can allowances. We do put limits on the use of credits. The credits are differentiated according to ozone season and non-ozone season, although the compliance period is a 12-month compliance period in Ontario. Credits are rate-based. In other words, we do not award credits for shutdowns, plant shutdowns. There must be a quantifiable improvement in emission rate per unit of output. And we have some safeguards to back up the need for rigor. We have pre-approved standard methods for the calculation of credits, and if there is a project type that comes along for which there is no standard method, then the proponent must work with us to establish the standard method, which is basically a quantification methodology, as part of the process for proceeding and crediting that kind of project. We require protocols, emission reduction reports, and independent verification. We have a public review and comment period, and we also have a review and approval process for credit creation. These are all costs, of course, but so far we think that the costs are worth it. There's also a cross-border component. I'll start with the second one first. Ontario will recognize reductions that are achieved in 12 bordering states plus the District of Columbia. They have to meet the same rules for rigor that an Ontario-based reduction must meet. And once approved for use in Ontario, they can be purchased by capped emitters to help them meet their compliance obligation. The other feature that we have is the use of U.S. Allowances, and this feature has not been used yet, but it could be because it's part of the regulation, and it works by an Ontario emitter purchasing a U.S. allowance on the U.S. EPA registry. It never leaves that registry, but we can, in Ontario, grant a credit, an Ontario credit, for that American allowance, provided the owner of it, the Ontario owner of it, demonstrates to us that it has been retired on the EPA registry. As I mentioned, that feature has not been used, mainly because prices for U.S. NOx and SO2 have been higher so far than Ontario NOx and SO2. And this last slide indicates the eligibility zone for credit creation, all of Ontario plus those 12 states and the District of Columbia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. There's a couple of clarifying questions which we'll do, and then we'll go to the other questions at the end after Danny's presentation. One is, are credits the same as offsets?
Yes.
Okay. And then the other is, do any other Canadian provinces have an SO2 NOx program such as Ontario's?
Alberta has a trading program. I'm not familiar with the details of it. And that's the only other one that I'm aware of.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you so much, John. So let's move on to Denny. And Denny, do you need me to move for you, or can you access the toggle?
I can do it. Let's try here. Yep, I'm all set. Okay, thank you very much, Judy, and pleasure to be with you. I'm going to try to step up to a somewhat higher level in terms of drawing some observations and broad lessons from the U.S. experience with emissions trading. That's where most of the experience has been, and the extent to which those are applicable for greenhouse gases. The presentation is based upon this work that was done about 4 years ago with Paul Joskow and David Harrison, two colleagues, that was published by the Pew Foundation, which looked at experience in 6 different U.S. emissions trading programs and sort of what were the lessons that could be drawn from them and what did they imply for greenhouse gas controls. That study is readily available at either of the websites that you see there, either at the Pew Center or at MIT at our website. And, whoops, I didn't hit the right. Okay, and the lessons, just to state up, the following slides is going to touch on each of these sort of 5 broad areas that we'd emphasize in terms of the fundamental structure of these programs. And rather than try to say something about each right now, I'll actually move into each of those slides and then talk a little bit more with respect to each one. So I think the first point we make is it's pretty clear from the experience in the United States that emissions trading works. And I guess you could ask, well, what do you mean by it works? And in some ways, you'd have to go back to the early 90s to understand this, when both Reclaim and the SO2 program were being proposed and put together. And there were a lot of people that simply doubted that markets would emerge, that because these were applied in the SO2 case to electric utilities, that the firms wouldn't trade, they would hoard the permits and so forth. And I guess one of the things that we did learn from the SO2 program, as well as the Reclaim to a lesser extent, but certainly from the SO2 program, were that these markets emerge effortlessly. Firms are quite ready to trade, even such conservative ones as electric utilities were viewed as being. And I think this is sort of taken now that it's so much for granted that people almost forget that this does happen. In every other program we have seen, we've got an abundance of intermediaries who come in and facilitate the trading, and firms seem perfectly happy to trade. So I think that's pretty well set. The second thing I think we can observe is that the cost savings from using emissions trading are substantial. they're not phenomenal. I mean, there has been a time where people have talked as if you do trading, it virtually makes the cost evaporate. There have been 2 fairly extensive studies with respect to the SO2 program trying to estimate, well, what was the magnitude of the cost savings given what a reasonable alternative that was the command and control alternative, and the demand for electricity and such at the time when the program was in effect. Those 2 studies agree, one by RFF, the other by ourselves. The savings are in the order about 50%. So that's significant. I mean, it's not a trivial savings, it's not a phenomenal savings, but it is an important and substantial savings worth pursuing. I think one of the surprises we've seen is that the environmental performance is better than what we can imagine in comparable cap and trade programs. And I guess there are several aspects to that, I think, when we think about why that is. And one point is that once decided in the legislature, if you think in the SO2 program, there's relatively quick implementation. And there isn't nearly as much or as contentious of regulatory procedures trying to implement as we've seen in the traditional command and control programs under the Clean Air Act, where there's many definitions about what will be the technology, what sort of exceptions, how do you deal with the issues of heterogeneity and such that arise in any practical application. The programs are also very effective because it imposes a very simple requirement. You just surrender the permits. It's very hard to imagine exceptions from this. It doesn't get into complicated issues about did you really have to shut down the scrubber or what were the circumstances under which you did that. And it presents an unavoidable price and cost given the opportunity cost of the permits on everyone who is emitting, something that other regulations don't do. Once you've met the standard, whatever you emit, there's no cost involved, where in these systems they impose that cost, and that provides continual pressure to try to reduce that cost as it would with any other input into the production process. And I think I'd argue that the simple requirement also facilitates a very strict accountability. I mean, you either have a permit or you don't. It doesn't get into the sort of fuzzy circumstances of what happened when you may not have been completely in compliance, and thereby avoids, and it also the problems of heterogeneity where you have a standard to be met, but it doesn't apply equally to everyone, and therefore it promotes inequities in its application and leads to a selective relaxation. In effect, the market sort of sorts all this out and provides an incentive for those for whom it's relatively easy, will do more than they might otherwise do or be required to do in order to facilitate the others. I think the one point, these programs have not all been successful. And I think the one program that I think is not very well known but is generally recognized as where the trading aspect really didn't work very well is the Chicago VOC program. And I think the phrase that people have done the study on this sort of characterized it as market window dressing. And essentially it was a cap and trade program overlaying regulatory or command and control system which was aimed at achieving the same objective, and it turned out to be more binding for most people than the other, and consequently it wasn't effective. Now I think that should be contrasted with the situation of the SO2 program, for instance, or the NOx programs where the cap has required more than what the existing regulatory structure has required, which is really aimed at local health issues. And in that sense, those regulations remained in place, but the cap and trade programs would bring down the aggregate, and it went beyond what was there in the conventional system. In the Chicago case, I think we see where we had essentially 2 policies aiming at the same objective, and only one of them turned out to be binding, as you'd expect in situations like that. I think I've got a situation here where I didn't get this. Let me put all this stuff up. Anyway, the second lesson is the critical issue in making these systems work is having a clearly defined and strictly enforced emission rights. These are, economists call these tradable permits. So you can think of it in some ways you have a permit just like you do in a conventional regulatory system, but they're not assigned permanently to a particular installation. They're attached to the right to emit, in effect, and it can be traded. And the basis upon which it works, and it's very important if you're going to have one of these systems, and it is what could be called technically a limited property right system, and it's very important to recognize that that's there and let those permits flow. What makes it effective are a couple of things. One is the recognition that the regulator doesn't have the information to regulate efficiently or most effectively even in that respect, and that goes back to this: how do you apply a single standard to a heterogeneous set of installations or technologies that are out there? The people who are being regulated always know more about what can be done than the regulator would ever know, and what we see in these systems is sort of a shift, a recognition by the regulator that they don't know everything, and a specialization that Brian referred to when he talked about the focus, that allows the regulator to focus on the cap as what's the aggregate amount of emissions, what are the rules of the market that we're going to create, and how do we measure and report and ensure compliance, which is this very easy proposition of just emissions versus the permits that get retired. So there's sort of a specialization of function that actually works favorably in terms of the environmental outcome. And of course, once you've distributed the permits, then you let the market distribute the allowances appropriately to achieve efficiency. And I think everybody, probably your cap and trade 101, you went into the reason equalizing marginal costs of why this comes about. The big condition here, of course, is that the regulator and those promoting these systems must be willing to accept market outcomes, and that's market outcomes and how you achieve the reduction. It isn't optional in whether you have the reduction or not, or whether you limit the emissions to the cap limit. It's rather just how do we achieve that. And this usually, sometimes people have preconceived notions about what fuels will be used or what will happen to certain things, which have tended more often than not to be disappointed. But anyway, if one wants to focus on that emission reduction, that's what these systems do, and you have to accept the sort of redistribution that takes place in the market in achieving that reduction. Let me go on to allocation, the third general lesson in design feature. I think it's fair to say that allocations are going to be a good deal more controversial for CO2 than for SO2 and NOx. And in some ways, you know, there's one big difference, that more money is involved with CO2 than SO2 or NOx. And also, I think SO2 and NOx had the benefit of being sort of the first kids on the block. People weren't quite fully aware of what was involved and the value being created, and so it was easier perhaps in some ways to do this, although there was still plenty of controversy on it, but it wasn't quite as public. I think it is fair to say, looking at the various programs and the various techniques of allocation, and the NOx program in particular, each state tends to its own allocation, and they do it. There's some pretty remarkable differences, and there's not much evidence that those differences in allocation have actually affected program performance in terms of reducing emissions and such. They, of course, have consequences in terms of equity and in terms of, you know, each permits are worth something, so the more you have, the better. And it has those effects, but in terms of program performance, that doesn't seem to have much effect. And the big issue always in these is when you create a cap, you create value, scarcity rents in economic terms, and the question is, how are you going to use that value that is actually being created by this decision, or how are you going to distribute these rights, because those rights are conveyed by the allowances. And you have you break down into initial issue of free allocation versus oftentimes called grandfathering versus auctioning. And of course you have free allocation, and that's typically going to the shareholders of the affected firms. That has been the tendency in the past. And of course then you have to ask how much to various firms, and what basis do you distribute it. And auctioning, in some ways, you've got the same value where the government basically takes the value but uses it for other purposes, which could be reducing other taxes for R&D, demand-side management, transition assistance, adaptation assistance. You can think of all sorts of uses in there. I think the one thing, although there are many, many arguments in allocation, I would argue this is essentially a political debate. If we're concerned about the environmental results, and from an economic standpoint, and argue sort of the equity issues are separated from the efficiency aspects. And I think it's also important when we say political debate, I don't mean that in sort of small, lower case, and there are grand principles, I would say, that are involved here. And essentially it's one of between what you could call principles of prior use versus higher social uses that you could put this value. And we live in a society, and we observe it in Europe as well as in North America, where we grant considerable precedence to existing use and prior use. And you have to think in these systems, you've got emitters who have invested capital and who have, in effect, sort of a squatter's right, you can call it an ecological right, to emit on one day, and then the law goes into effect, and they no longer have that right, and they incur a cost. And then you can ask, okay, after the policy's gone in place, who are the people who are going to use the rights that we've created? And it's going to be the same people. So it's pretty clear from a political standpoint, an easy way out is just give the permits to the people who are going to need them. We see that particularly in the European system of being argued. I think that's the underlying argument. But I think to think more profoundly about this, you're really recognizing the sort of prior use claims. Now, those are not perpetuities. And the contending view, which of course represented by the auctioning, particularly the 100% auctioning argument, is of course that no, there are higher social uses to which this money could be put rather than going to who would be the ultimate recipients or, let's say, shareholders of the firms that happen to be affected and, obviously use the money in various ways, but it's broader. And that's, we could talk a lot about that. The one thing I would urge you is don't fall prey to what a colleague of mine calls the piñata theory of allocation, whereby you ignore these more fundamental principles that underlie allocation. The piñata, of course, being the analogy that it's a great ball of goodies hanging from the ceiling, and once the ball is broken, the goodies fall out and everybody scrambles to see what they can get. And if you look at any actual allocation, you will find that there's quite a bit of reason you can extract some pretty profound principles from how it actually is done. And I think it is fair to say, for all the debate, that we have all existing systems, and by this I mean all systems that are currently in existence have a high degree of free allocation. The highest level of actual existing system is 8.8% in Germany under the European Emission Trading System. There are many that are proposing to have much higher levels, RGGI most of all, but it hasn't yet gone into effect. And I think it's fair to say that there is an emerging consensus, or I think there is a consensus, it's not just emerging, it's here, that the sort of perpetuities which are granted in the NOx program, the SO2 program, and reclaim would not continue. And that over time, some period of time to be defined, free allocation would be phased out, that those that happen to be on the ground when the program starts don't have a claim forever on those rights. It would ultimately transfer to the government or to society at large. And the real question in some ways is going to be, what is the level of initial free allocation, and how quickly and over what time period will it be phased out? A further feature is on banking and borrowing. I think where this has been allowed, this feature has tended to dampen price fluctuations. And we see a great debate in CO2 at the federal level of where, let's say, banking has tended to be allowed in all of the programs in the United States. And we've seen in them it provides a form of early action when you have a phased-in program that imposes higher costs later on. It just makes makes more sense to abate, use up your lower cost options early on and bank the credits to go on. Typically, borrowing has not been permitted, although it must be noted that in the European system and under the Kyoto system, within each trading period or commitment period, there is complete banking and borrowing between years. I'll come back in the European one to where there is a restriction between periods. In the U.S., I think the lack of borrowing has led to the safety valve debate, which is somehow that you have to think that banking in some way provides a floor on prices. Because if the price is really cheap now and you expect it to be much more expensive later, then you'll tend to continue to comply and bank. And the fear is always of the upward spikes like we've seen in Reclaim and other cases, where if you don't have borrowing, then there's really no limit, and therefore you need a safety valve. And we certainly see in the CO2 debate, in looking at the bills before the Senate, where one has a safety valve, the other has borrowing, which is a fairly radical proposal in U.S. and environmental economics in this area.
Denny, can you just remind folks what banking and borrowing are?
Okay. Banking means that you're issued a permit for the current compliance period, typically a year, and if you don't use it, you can use it any later period, but you can't use it before. So you're issued an allowance for year 2005 or whatever it happens to be. If you don't use it that year, you can use it in 06 or 07 or any later year. Borrowing essentially says that, okay, you have an allocation of permits, and you can use one from a forward year to cover needs in the current year. So essentially, you're taking away from the permits, you're using up a permit that you would have had tomorrow, you're using it today. So it's essentially trading across time. You can think of it as where most trading we think of as spatial among different groups in the same period. Banking and borrowing can also be considered intertemporal trading, and you're allowing that to be traded across periods. And typically it's been only banking is allowed, not borrowing. But we're now seeing, I think it's fair to say, that there's a much greater acceptance of borrowing, and it may be limits on how far forward you can borrow, and you may have some sort of interest rate to pay. But the idea is that yes, if you have, you can use a permit from the future for the current period of time. Now, it needs being said that, of course, to have banking and borrowing, you really want to have a stock pollutant, or what's not sort of a local. The NOx program, for instance, has had the progressive flow control until recently, or until CARE comes into effect, to try to limit this. And reclaim, of course, does not permit any banking or borrowing for any practical purposes. In the case of greenhouse gases, we're talking very long-lived gases, and whether reductions are made this year or next year or 2 years from now really doesn't make a whole lot of difference, just like it doesn't make any difference as to whether it is done here or in China. And I think I would say, as far as some of the price effects, or the most current and perhaps the best example of the effect of banking and borrowing restrictions, I made the comment before that within trading periods in the European system, there's complete banking or borrowing. But in the initial trial period, they did not permit any banking or borrowing between the trial or the first period and the second period that started 8 days ago with the start of the Kyoto period. And that restriction has led to a circumstance. This is a picture of the prices. This is the effects of a banking restriction, the inter-period banking restriction. So that red line that you see is the spot price, or the December 07 price, essentially the forward future price for the first period allowances that could be used in 05, 06, or 07. And the black line is the price for allowances in 2008, the December 08 maturity or second period allowances. And you'll see about 2/3 of the way 2006, these two had kept pretty close together early on, or from the time the December 08 became introduced. But you'll see that they've separated greatly, and we have the interesting phenomena just in this past week, that if you think about it, that the cost of a CO2 emission in Europe up until midnight, December 31st, was about 3 cents. For any generator or anything emitting emissions on December 31st, it was 3 cents a ton. On January 1st at midnight, it switched to 23 euros per ton. Now, there was some redistribution of emissions, obviously, of people working around that limit, but you can see there's a big price difference, and it's essentially because you cannot use the permits in the first period. There were good political reasons for this restriction. There was fears the system wouldn't work, there would be too big of a surplus, and they didn't want to complicate circumstances for the second period. But it does illustrate that those restrictions do have effects, and it will lead to that type of pricing behavior that you observe there. Let me talk finally about offsets and linking. John talked somewhat about this. This is, I would agree, is always a problematic issue. We're essentially talking about the anyway tons problem, and we can talk offsets. Credits are the same sort of thing. Linking systems. John expressed one potential linking there, described one linking of the Canadians accept U.S. permits. The U.S. system doesn't accept Canadian SO2 permits, so you've got a one-way linking there. But anyway, typically this refers to the use of offsets, opt-ins, or credits. General economic arguments are always in favor of making the system wider. If there are lower cost options outside and have the same environmental effect, then let them be used. But the transaction costs typically limit the applicability of these offsets, and particularly because of the difficulty of proving that indeed this is a true reduction or proving up additionality and so forth. That's always limited the cost of these. And again, it becomes tricky of knowing whether that's really the case. It's very hard to prove it because you're trying to prove what didn't actually occur. Something happened, but there's something else that would have occurred, and it becomes difficult. In the case of a greenhouse gas program, I think there are strategic arguments in favor of taking a rather liberal view towards offsets, which is, first of all, it's a means of developing the trading institutions that Brian referred to that are needed as part of the infrastructure, and particularly in the developing world, to where they become familiar with trading, become familiar with the monitoring, the reporting, and such, that through credit programs enables that. And you might ask, okay, well, how much laxness can we allow to, develop that type of experience? And it also is paving the way for a more comprehensive system in the sense that once as people become more familiar with it, and that the next step becomes accepting a cap, and that's a whole other issue, but I think it prepares the way for what ultimately would be a global system. I think it is important, although much can be made of the difficulty of proving additionality, that there are credible tests. They must be met, and they can be met to a sufficient degree of accuracy. And so the emphasis I would place on this is that you really want a pragmatic, open, rigorous type provision. So you need to have an open system, be pragmatic about it, but also you cannot afford to be anything but rigorous about that the offsets must be truly additional. Let me move on to the final slide here and just put these up. I think points here, I think the experience to date certainly supports the notion that cap and trade mechanisms can be used to reduce emissions. They do it effectively. They do it efficiently. The design issues are complex, and one can go into many hours of discussing them, but they can be mastered. They're not insuperable. It is, I think it's fair to say, with CO2, we see it in the European system and in the debate in the United States and elsewhere, as well as in the regional systems, that allocation has become a very big issue. It is an equity issue, as I talked about before, and it is potentially complicating progress. There is an issue of how much we care about that as opposed to just getting something in place which reduces emissions. But it is, I believe, unavoidable because you are dealing with a lot of money, and there are a lot of unresolved issues about just who has the right to this and how does society going to deal with distributing these benefits or these rents that have been created. So it is going to take some time, and we just have to be careful. We have to be careful that we don't let those concerns get in the way of actually taking action. And finally, I think one of the issues to always keep in mind for any set of regulators is are you ready to focus on emission reductions alone and let the markets work? What characterizes these systems is sort of a division of labor between the regulator and the regulated, where the regulator says essentially you can do what you want just so you have a permit. We're going to create the scarcity, you get the rights, you have the flexibility to meet with it, but there's no ifs, ands, and buts, and no arguing about whether you're complying or not. And it's that focus which gives the programs their force, but it also and lets markets do what they do well, but it also implies accepting those market outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Denny. We have, luckily, even though we started late, we've got plenty of time for questions. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to go right into it. The first couple of questions are just clarifying questions for Denny on his presentation, and then we're going to go to ask everybody, all three presenters, these questions. The first one for Denny is you had said that the cost savings for these kind of programs are around 50%. Can you explain where that number comes from and whether it's changed over time?
No, it'd be hard to say whether it's changed over time. I mean, let's say the two fairly complete studies that have been done on this were done in the late 90s with respect to the SO2 program. And they were each done, it involves creating a counterfactual as what do you think is going to happen and what would be the alternative program. In the case of the study that we did, we basically assume, let's suppose that the allowance allocations, it was non-tradable, so that all these installations had a set that each of those allocations was in fact a cap, a quantity cap that would be enforced on each of those power plants out there. And so what are the gains from having being able to trade? And I think the key point is not 50%. And, you know, there may be programs where it's going to be 30% or maybe 70%, but I think the point I would stress here is it's not trivial. There's nothing to suggest that these are trivial gains. That we're talking of a few percentage points that are in the noise in terms of the cost savings. There's enough cost savings that make it worth doing because of the incentives that are set up. But it's also true that emission trading does not make the costs go away and simply, you know, they're just phenomenal. There were assertions at one time of like 90% cost savings because of emissions trading. It's simply not the miracle regulation in that sense. It does impose cost, and there are real cost savings from it.
Thanks. And one other question was somebody asked if you could explain what additionality means.
Okay, additionality means that when you create a credit, so let's think you have a credit is created that would be in a system that would be allowable, made equivalent to an allowance, which says that a particular firm has made a reduction of emissions. And the question is, okay, would that have been done anyway? So let's imagine a situation where you might say natural gas prices, let's think of power generation, natural gas prices have gone down a lot. And so it's very cheap to generate electricity using gas-fired power plants. And so the emissions are lower. And people would say we should have credits for that because we reduced our emissions from what they were before, what they would have been if we dispatched our coal plants. Well, the fact is they dispatched the gas plants because gas prices were cheap. That would be considered, that's not truly additional. That happened anyway, and if you create a credit, then you're just inflating the cap. On the other hand, if a person actually undertakes measures which would reduce those emissions that they would not do otherwise, then you've created additionality. So it's this, the difficulty is sort of what would you have done, you know, in the case absent with some applicant coming in a credit. I mean, John is certainly in their, you know, cap credit and trade program. He could probably say quite a bit on some of the, what are the criteria and how they deal with this particular problem. But it's a continual problem of how do you, you know, how do you define what the emissions would have been in the other case, and is this an emission reduction that would have occurred in any case? If it is, then there's no real environmental gain. In fact, it's a loosening. If it would not have, then you should give credit for it if it meets the other environmental criteria.
John, do you want to comment on additionality?
We dealt with additionality by not taking a position on it. And I can recall some conversations. We talked about it a lot. And the conversations kind of went along the lines of, well, how can you tell what's going on in the mind of that firm that made the reduction? They come to us and tell us that they wouldn't have made the reduction for any other reason than to make the reduction. And how do you know that's true? And so we decided that we would deal with it by not bothering with it. We focused on other aspects of rigor, like the surplus rule, which is akin to an additionality rule, but not identical to it.
So when I think maybe there's a slightly different definition. I think what you're saying is that the way you defined additionality was based on whether it was surplus to regulation, whether it was in addition to what was already required. That was kind of your definition. Because in order to award a credit, you have to have some sense that it wouldn't have happened anyway, right?
Not necessarily. No. And there's more to the thinking than that. If you have a really active program that involves a lot of emission reductions that are taking place, some of them are going to be additional, some are not going to be additional. But the point is, if you have a declining cap, and that the rate of decline is quite demanding, then you will quickly pick the low-hanging fruit on the credit side and get to the point where people start, because of the value of the credits in such a system, people start making those reductions because they want to sell credits, not because there is some other business reason.
Okay. Brian, this is a question for you. What have been the administrative costs of the SO2 and NOx programs?
Okay, let me sort of describe it, then you can sort of judge from it. We've evolved over time. We currently have about 50 people in Washington and a few people in the regions who work on the acid rain program. Some of those people are involved in designing new programs and in assessment work. So there are about 30 people who are involved in sort of direct day-to-day operations of this program, about half of them overseeing the monitoring activity and the other half involved in the trading and accounts and the reporting of emissions and allowance data, et cetera. So, if I said operationally, it takes 30 to 40 people nationally to run that program. The NOx program, because it built off the SO2 program, is, it's maybe another, 10 or 15 people, because it's the same sources in most cases, the same monitoring systems. So there's a lot of savings from, the overlap in the programs. So that should give you a fairly good idea of the number of people. We've spent a fair amount on software development over the years, and it has gone through several generations from the early days in the 90s when we collected data on diskettes. People remember those days, to the time now when everything is submitted over the Internet. We also give the sources tools to use to check their data before they submit it to us, so that the quality of the data coming in is far superior to what it was 10 years ago. So there's an investment that's been running probably a couple $1 million a year over the last 10 years that's been involved in all the upgrades and improvements in the data systems. And we're coming sort of to the end of that cycle of upgrades and improvements, if that helps.
And how does that compare to the administrative costs of more traditional kinds of programs?
Well, the AIR program in the United States, there are about 1,800 people at EPA. There are about 10 or 12,000 people at state and local governments who just do air pollution control. I know that a lot of that work is spent in permitting and enforcement and various activities to control approximately 100,000 sources nationwide. But generally there are a lot more people per ton of pollution reduction involved in traditional programs. And I should say that in the 70s and 80s I did command and control work, and I was involved in some emission trading activity, the credit activity you were talking about, and it was sort of from the experiences of dealing with both those programs that I learned things that I did not want to do again if I were designing a new program. And so a lot of the cap and trade program is a result of not repeating some of the things we did because they were so resource intensive, time consuming, and painful all around that I was looking for a way to reduce those costs. And so I think we pretty much accomplished that with far fewer people, and that has made it also very successful because we're able to sustain the resources annually to budget that. And I know in the other areas we're always desperate for resources both at the state and federal level to deal with toxics and other pollutants, and that's a constant sort of reality that we face in government in general.
Thanks, Brian. This is an interesting question. Someone's asking whether the experience from NOx and SOx is really applicable, because with CO2 we actually don't have control technology for CO2. And I don't know, maybe Denny, you want to start, and maybe everybody wants to jump in on this one.
Yes, I think the difference is that we don't have experience with the control technology. The technology is there, and in carbon capture and sequestration. I mean, MIT did a big study on this, which it released earlier this year, and a relevant point to make is that everything that you need to do for carbon capture and sequestration is now being done. but not at the scale required, not in an integrated fashion. So we capture CO2 for soda and other, industrial carbon dioxide uses. It's pumped underground for enhanced oil recovery and actually stored and transported considerable distances. But it's not really geared to operating an electric utility plant and at the scale. And everything we know about the cost from what we observe suggests it's going to be very expensive. And by that I mean something in the order of $50 a ton. We would estimate $30, $50 a ton to remove that. And and no one's really done it. Where you think in the SO2 program, you had some 150 or 60 scrubbers that had already been built, but the SO2 program went in. So there's no question of you knew how to reduce SO2. It was a question of where you put a scrubber or whether you did, and how much coal switching you had, and different competing techniques. And although NOx with SCRs, it was not quite as much experience with them. There was more comfort about their being there. I think one of the lessons that we've learned from all the existing programs is there are other abatement techniques that emerge that weren't anticipated. I don't want to take the time to go through those and say NOx and SO2. And if you think about in CO2, there's differing dispatch of power plants that can take place. I mean, many people advocate environmental dispatch. If you have a carbon price, it's going to move you towards an environmental dispatch rather than a cost-based dispatch. There are many things that BP, for instance, in their trading system, when we put this into effect, there were all sorts of what they called leak plugging and things that we knew increased efficiency because it now became worthwhile to do something. One of the big issues looking at the CO2 program in Europe that we're involved in is now actually trying to determine what has been the effect of the fairly high price during those early years of the program, and subsequently from now on where it's back to a high price. So I think it's fair to say we don't have as much comfort with the control technology, but nobody's talking about prices that would be that high either in Europe or here, at least immediately. And what you need is the experience with that, and there are many things short of the, let's say, deep abatement technology that can be done and are being done in Europe.
John, John, do you want to comment on that?
Only from the point of view that control technology is only part of the solution, and you get into fuel switching and efficiency projects that lend themselves to offset creation, for example.
And Brian, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, just a couple things. One is I would agree with everything that both John and Denny said. I wanted to give one other criteria and also one example. And it was sort of the mid-'90s when we were considering doing NOx, and I remember going to a meeting and someone said to me, so where's the technology? Because at that time SCR was not used in the U.S. to any extent, maybe a single facility. We couldn't even get examples to base our rules on. And so they're saying, gee, it's not proven, we don't have that. And I said, look, when I watched SO2, what people did was they took scrubbers from 90% control when we were told they could do no more than 92. Before the bill was signed, people bought scrubbers at 98%. I mean, I was sort of shocked that the technology was there and no one had told us up until the year that this was occurring that it could happen. So it tended to push things much further than they had gone. The cost came down about 50% on scrubbers because now there was an incentive to drive the cost down. The low sulfur coal shipments to the east led to more rail lines and competition in the rail industry and lowered costs there and production facilities. But the other thing, as I said, I don't know what's going to happen. I know there is enough control technology that could do it, but I'm sure people will come up with things that will lower the cost. One of the things they did was we knew that low NOx burners, no, it wasn't even low NOx burners, it was simply operation of boilers, could reduce the amount of NOx emissions. But we were told, based on work that had been done, that 5%, maybe 10% at the most you might get from the air mixture in the boiler. And I remember as soon as the program went into effect, companies in Pennsylvania started experimenting with how much they could change the mixture to reduce NOx, and they got up to 20 to 30% NOx reductions by altering just the mixture of the combustion, which cost them virtually nothing. And that sort of reduced the entire cost of the program because it was sort of at the first end, first reductions you were making. The other thing I'd say about carbon is it is true that a lot of this stuff is not in quite the shape that we found for SO2 and NOx, but also the time frames we're talking about are very different. What we did in SO2 and NOx is we asked for reductions in 3 to 5 years, 8 years, in that time frame, which was closer to the way traditional air pollution had been done. What we're talking about with carbon is trying to turn the curve from going up to flat and then turn the curve down. And the significant reductions are 30, 40 years out. So it's very important to let people know where you're going so that you can put on the additional incentive and pressure to develop the more transforming technologies. But I would not advocate, in 10 years we're going to get a 50 or 60% reduction in CO2. I think we have to look at the time frame, and we have to look at what's possible over time to achieve some of the more significant reductions.
Thanks so much. Okay, let's go to the phones. I've always wanted to say that. I think if I click on this line and if I take the next question, does that mean is the questioner, is their line ready to go?
Yep. We're ready for your question. I guess we've lost that caller. Do you want to try the next one?
Sure.
We're ready for your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, hi. This is Lee Alts with Arizona DEQ. I listen to your program frequently and really enjoy it. I've always wanted to say that, too. But I won't ask a wacko question here. But in the Western Climate Initiative, we're looking at creating a market that would really be the participation of a number of states and provinces voluntarily creating this market. And I'm wondering what the panelists might suggest that is essential for us to do or essential to avoid in that context. I mean, so I understand the importance of monitoring and maintaining the credibility and the value of allowances. That's universal. But in the context of the WCI, where jurisdictions are voluntarily coming together, what is really important that maybe we do or that we don't do? And I'll take my answer off the air.
Okay, who wants to take a crack at this?
I'll start off. I'm sure Brian will have something to say here as well. I must say I find it very hard to imagine. I mean, in some sense, you could say any program is voluntary. I mean, societies are set up to make decisions, and they decide whether, we're in a great debate in the United States, are we going to have a system or not for greenhouse gases? And there have been debates on these earlier programs. But it's very hard for me to see that you can have a program where people can either come in or out or decide whether they want to be in or not. And let's say they can always any group can adopt certain requirements that they enforce in some manner among themselves. I mean, we're starting to talk about what a government is. But it's very hard for me to imagine a state that would join one of these, and you're either going to have to decide, and if you construct this market, that there's certain people going to be in the market, and I don't know that you can say, okay, well, those electric utilities or those parties who want to be a part can, others can't, but we're going to control emissions. Somehow you've got to do something. Now, you have had approaches that have been taken in Europe, like we're going to slap a tax on you, but if you join the trading system in the UK, essentially they had a tax, but if you join the trading system, then you don't have to pay the tax. Okay, but that's, and you could say it's totally voluntary, but I mean, there's a certain element, and I think the fundamental issue here is certain levels of government have to decide if they're going to have a program, and there's going to have to be some form of enforcement. I mean, even something voluntary, let's say like the CCX, I think has certain rules among their members. The problem with the CCX is the sort of voluntary nature, whether you want to become a member or not. And so it's very hard for me to see whether it's RGGI, WCI, others. I mean, states could join together and say, we have targets and we're going to implement that in some various ways and we mean to get there. But if you're going to actually have a trading system, I think you've got to have some sort of enforcement there. I just don't see how you get away with it. It's true for any regulation. And there's a mandatory element there. So,
do Brian or John want to comment on that as well?
Well, this is Brian. I would tend to agree with Denny. I'm always sort of, and maybe the questioner wants to amplify a little bit on what they mean by a voluntary program, because it can mean 100 different things, and it makes it sort of hard to say. But I generally think that a cap-and-trade program is a mandatory kind of activity, and defining the scope and who's in and what the permits or allowances are that you're giving out are all these upfront decisions, and then you live with it for a long time. It's not something that you come in and out of. I imagine buying a car as a voluntary transaction, then I decide later I don't want the car. I don't know how you effectuate sort of voluntary transactions. And if you want states to come in and out, I think particularly with a utility grid, that's very hard, because the utilities are interconnected on 3 grids in the U.S., and they go up into Canada. And, the state that comes in and out, the power is going to shift back and forth to some degree as a result of their participation. And I think you need to sort of know that going in. Everyone, all the players, all the participants need to have a sense of who's part of this game, and they have to make their decisions based on that too. So it's not just the quote voluntary participants that's at stake. It's all the other people who have made choices are basing it on their perception or understanding of who's participating and not participating. So I think it's a significant upfront commitment that needs to be made.
This is John. I'd agree with that, but I think that there's a little bit of confusion through the use of the word voluntary. It's true that each state and province that joins WCI and makes the commitment to it is doing so voluntarily. But once that commitment is made, then the folks within each of those jurisdictions, the emitters, the major emitters, are going to have mandatory requirements. And there's going to have be some contractual way that the jurisdictions are going to be bound to ensure that the caps within their jurisdictions are met.
Great, thanks.
Can you hear me, Judy?
Yes.
Oh, hi. Yeah, and I think John picked up on the point I was trying to make, and I apologize for using that word. It is a blend. The way we're discussing things at WCI, we would have mandatory caps, but the regional market and how the geographic coverage of it would depend on who opts into the program. So it could be a 8 jurisdictional program, later it could be a 10 jurisdictional program, and it's really a cooperation, a voluntary cooperation among those 10 jurisdictions, each of which is regulating its sources, but the cross-border trading and agreements to certain standards and recognizing each other's allowances, that's all done cooperatively, voluntarily among the jurisdictions. There's no federal mandate. There's no single enforcer behind this program.
Other than the contracts among the participating jurisdictions.
Right. So
those contracts are going to be important. We might end up calling them memoranda of understanding, but still, I think each participating jurisdiction is going to be watching carefully to make sure the others are adhering to their contractual obligation to manage their own emitters effectively.
So that would be an essential. That would be an additional element that's not in these previous presentations. What if there's just a bad player, whether it's intentional or not? How do we remove that player from this regional market to preserve the benefits that everybody else was anticipating?
Yeah, and that's something that WCI is going to have to come to grips with, how they do that.
Let me point out also, I think this is, when you think about CO2 in a global system, I mean, you could substitute nation state as well as for state or province in this discussion as well. And that, It's a question of how do you create the inducements, the reputational, all these issues that John's referring to in contract. It's got to be some sort of overarching structure. And you can look in Europe. I'm doing my research on the European system now. Of course, they have sort of an almost accidental structure in the European Union. That's a very weak federation, but it's there which serves as you're part of the European Union, then you've got to be part of the system, which helps to bind people in. But and they can enforce the rules through that, although Norway is not a part, and they've become a part of the trading system. They're people on the outside, and that's what linking is all about. I think there is this, whatever group. I think a lot of my remarks are, I'm assuming there's some government entity that creates the stability of the system which is necessary for the incentives that Brian talked about, and whether that's an aggregation of states or whether it's a federal level or some sort of global aggregation. I think those are all, but that comes back to what are the government's mechanisms over this market, and it must have some sort of stability, or what John called those contractual arrangements or governance arrangements.
Okay, moving back to one of the questions that was submitted on the chat section. This questioner wants to know a little bit what you mean by a safety valve option. This is for Denny.
Okay. The safety valve states that, there should be some price at which, if the market price goes higher than that level, that the government will take payments, will either issue allowances at that amount or take payments in lieu of allowances, which are therefore tend to cap the price. So it's oftentimes called a price cap. In effect, it relaxes the cap. It issues more allowances for that period to keep the price from going any higher. And it's an alternative. So you can say it's a trading system unless the price cap level is triggered, then of course that's the price and it goes no higher. So you can think of it as a price cap. It becomes a hybrid price and quantity system. It's highly controversial, but there's strong advocacy of it in many parties because of the fear the prices would go very high, typically citing the reclaim experience and the reclaim NOx markets in 2000.
Okay, it looks like I have another question from the phone, and hopefully. Hello, you can ask your question. I guess maybe not.
Judy.
Yes.
This is Lee, but I didn't ask another question, so you might want to check how your system's working.
On many fronts. Thank you. Okay. Another question that's come up that's another sort of tack here is how would we think about this kind of approach, a cap-and-trade approach, compared to, let's say, a renewable portfolio standard approach? Is that also a market-based approach, or is that more prescriptive? Is it more prescriptive in some ways and less prescriptive in another? Anybody want to take that one on?
Yeah, I'd be glad to talk to that. I think, renewable portfolio standards, interesting concept. As I gather, there are several different meanings of this, but let's say if you think of the tradable renewable certificate system, that yes, that's mandating a certain type of technology. But it's saying within the trading bounds, if it's a tradable system, then it's saying we don't care where it's created or who does it or what have you, but whoever generates, if you think of the REC system in Texas, for instance, okay, it's wherever you create and you generate renewable energy, then you get credits, and the regulatory system has created a requirement that distributors have to have a certain percentage of these credits. So you've created a market, and it's tradable. So that's a market solution for that outcome. I think it bears making the point that a cap-and-trade program does have a mandate. And the mandate is that you've got to have a permit, an allowance. You've got to surrender an allowance for all the emissions. And but that's the end of the mandate. That's it. Otherwise, it's the regulator sort of hands off, let the market sort of figure out what's going to happen, who's going to reduce, and so on. And so I think you have to, what are you really mandating in a tradable RPS system, if we mean there as opposed to just a certain percentage within the state, or every distributor has to have 10% renewable or something. If it's a tradable system, then your mandate.
If there are any participants out there who want to enter their questions, we may have lost your questions. You can try re-entering your questions.
Right. There's one, Laura, somebody wants to serve as moderator. I thought there was some good questions came up on how do you deal with dispersed sources on a cap and trade program.
Oh, that's great. If you can remember a question that you'd like to deal with, please, by all means, take it, and I'll try to help Judy.
Okay. There was one questioner, one participant noted, asked, how do you deal with dispersed sources so you understand the monitoring is very important and such. And I think this comes into the issue of whether you go upstream or downstream is another question suggested. And it is true, any one of these cap and trade systems, it's founded basically upon you've got to be able to measure the emissions. And so it's a question, okay, how would you measure that? And for large stationary sources, it's easy to see how you measure the emissions, and you have one of these systems. When you talk about transportation, automobiles or households and things like that, you have to go upstream. And by that, it's you measure the carbon at, say, the refinery gate or the carbon content of the fuel, and you tax it or you require the permits to be surrendered at refinery gate. That cost gets passed on. And that would be the way you'd include those sources, essentially because you're not going to have emission reduction capability in the car and households. People have a higher price, so you have the demand effects, but you don't have the abatement technology possibility. So you can have a system that's all or mostly upstream, and that can be done for large sources as well. So I think if you're going to have small sources, you've got to go upstream. The European system is learning that with small industrial sources.
That's for a cap and trade program. I agree. The alternative is to include the transportation sector on the offset side.
Right.
This is Judy. I'm back. It looks like we have another question from the phone, so I'm going to open that line.
Oh, hi. This is Greg. I just wanted to let you know that I could hear the dialogue. I don't have an actual question. During the break, I could hear the dialogue, so thanks.
Thanks. Okay, it looks like there's one more, so I'm going to try that.
Yes, this is Ray. I'm curious as to how the cost for, say, an allocation would be passed through to an electric customer, say a retail customer. How is that going to be built into the contracts or the rates?
Brian,
Anyone?
I'll give a general answer, and Denny probably can do more specifically. In the U.S., we basically have regulated and deregulated areas, so it's different. In the regulated states, which was the traditional approach, when there was a cost imposed on the utility, they would have to go to their PUC and ask that it be reflected in rates, that rates be adjusted to allow them to cover the costs imposed. And so it would be a rate hearing, and rates would be affected for industrial and residential commercial customers, depending on the decisions they made. In a deregulated market, the costs are passed through much more directly by the company, and that can affect what the customer sees at the other end. And I'm not the best one to explain the nuances of the difference, but eventually the cost ends up with a customer.
Right. I think Brian's distinction is exactly the right one to make between the recovery and not. See, I think if you're a cost-regulated electric utility, you can only recover costs. If the allowances are given to you for free, there's no cost. So that cost, let's say the value of those allowances gets passed through into lower electricity rates for the customers, or you could say they receive the value of those allowances. Now, economists would tell you that's a bad thing because you want to have the demand effects and you want to have electricity prices increasing. Those same utilities, if you had 100% auctioning, then, of course, they'd have to pay for those, and those would be a cost. So much of the argument about over free allocation versus auctioning will come from regulated parts of the country who will say if there's auctioning, it will increase electricity rates, and I'm against it for that reason.
Right.
Whereas if it's free allocation, then we can pass it on to customers. If you're a deregulated market, then the generators are alert to the opportunity cost, all the economic arguments. It really doesn't make any difference whether it's allocated freely, in case that's giving the value to the shareholders, or whether it's auctioning, in which case then the same ones have to buy it. Customers will see no difference in either case. To a first approximation, both of those cases, there are many sort of further details that one could go into how do regulations actually work, and are people able to pass on all opportunity costs. But as a first approximation, that's the difference.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time, so I guess I just thought I'd give you each like a 30-second opportunity. I mean, John, is there a point you'd like to make sure gets made, and then Brian, and then Danny? John?
No, I think I'm satisfied that we pretty well covered it.
And Brian?
Well, I would just say that there's many, many more questions and discussions one could have on this, and I would remind people my message is to keep focused on what your goal is and not get tangled as much in the allocations until you've decided what you want to do and how big it is. And I think with regard to electricity, I did make the point when we were working on the California MAC that if possible, the Western grid, which encompasses most of the states in the WCI are part of the Western grid, you're almost to the point where you have a non-leakage situation, which makes regulating the utility sector much easier than when you have only a few states in and the power is transferred back and forth between states. Just to consider that when you're thinking about what to do.
Anything, Danny?
No, I'm happy. I think everything's been said.
Well, thank you so much to all our speakers. I really appreciate it. Sorry for these a couple of these technical difficulties. Appreciate everybody's participation. They were a great set of questions. Our next webinar is a week from today on Tuesday, January 15th. It's 11 to 1 p.m. Pacific time. Also, for those of you, 12 noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, 1 to 3 Central, and 2 to 4 Eastern. And that next one is Cap and Trade Design Issues in Depth Part 2. And that's going to be moderated by Franz Litz of the World Resources Institute, and we're going to hear from Peter Zappel from the European Commission and Chris Sherry from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So we're going to hear about lessons from RGGI and the EU ETS. So thanks again to our speakers and to all of our participants, and we look forward to having all of you participate next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.